April 26, 1956, Port Newark, New Jersey, berth 26. An old tanker sits low in the water, its deck reinforced with raw steel, 58 metal boxes lashed to its top, cargo it was never built to carry. Dock workers stand off to the side, watching a converted oil tanker do something no ship in American shipping history had ever done. A crane lifts one box after another, setting each down in less time than it used to take a gang of stevedores to unload a single crate. Nobody says it out loud, but everyone on that dock is thinking the same thing. This changes everything, and not for them. Somewhere in that crowd, so the story goes, stands a top official from one of the most powerful dockworkers' unions in the country. Asked what he thinks of the new ship, he doesn't hesitate. He says he'd like to sink it where it sits. The man who built that ship wasn't a shipping man. He'd never designed a hull, never studied naval architecture, never worked a day on the water. He was a truck driver from rural North Carolina who bought his first used truck during the Great Depression because he couldn't afford college. His name was Malcolm McLean, and over the next 20-some minutes, I'm going to show you how a man with a high school education and a fleet of trucks took on trucking companies, railroads, dockworkers unions, and federal transportation law itself, and beat all four using nothing but a careful reading of the rules. Naval architects he consulted told him a ship stacked that high with boxes would roll upside down in open water. He was laughed off a stage at an international shipping conference in Brussels for describing the idea to an audience of career maritime men. And here's the part that should surprise you. The ship, the boxes, the crane, that wasn't even the boldest move he made. That was just the one people could see. Over the next several chapters, I'm going to walk you through 5 separate moves McLean made between 1955 and the early 1960s. 5 specific ways he read a law, an assumption, or a piece of unused space more literally than every competitor around him. Not vague business book platitudes about thinking different, actual regulations, actual dollar figures, the actual court case that decided whether his company would be allowed to survive at all. Notice as we go, not one of these 5 moves required a laboratory, a patent nobody else could get, or a fortune he didn't personally risk. Every one of them came from a man asking a question the transportation industry had quietly stopped asking. What does the rule actually say, word for word? And who benefits from everyone assuming it says something slightly different? Let's start with the rule that was supposed to keep him exactly where he was. In 1937, a 24-year-old McLean delivered a truckload of cotton bales to a pier in New Jersey and then waited most of a day while stevedores unloaded it bale by bale, one at a time by hand. He watched his truck sit there, engine off, earning him nothing, while men carried his cargo up a gangplank piece by piece. He never forgot it. Over the following 2 decades, he built McLean Trucking Company from a single second-hand truck into one of the largest trucking operations in the United States. By the mid-1950s, a fleet of well over 1,000 trucks and dozens of terminals spread across the East Coast. But the entire industry he operated in was strangled by a single federal body. The Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, controlled which routes a trucker could run, what he could charge, and whether he was even allowed to lower his own prices. If McLean tried to cut a rate to win business, competing truckers and railroads could formally protest it, and the protest alone was often enough to freeze the change in a committee room for months. The rulebook was, on paper, about fair competition in practice. It meant that every major move you made could be blocked by the very companies you were trying to beat. McLean studied that rulebook the way a lawyer studies a contract he's about to break, not to find a way around it, but to find out exactly what it actually prohibited. Buried inside the Interstate Commerce Act was a specific clause. No person or company could hold common ownership of 2 or more carrier types, trucking and shipping, for instance, without direct commission approval. Everyone read that clause as a wall. You could be a trucking man or a shipping man, but the law made it painfully difficult to be both. McLean read the same sentence and noticed what nobody else was acting on. It didn't forbid leaving trucking behind entirely and becoming a shipping man instead. It only forbade holding both at once. So he did something his own friends reportedly told him was insane. In 1955, at the peak of his trucking company's success, he sold his controlling interest, roughly 1,700 trucks, for $6 million. Walked away from the industry he'd spent 20 years building. and used the proceeds along with a separate multi-million-dollar loan to buy into Pan Atlantic Steamship Corporation, a struggling coastal shipping line out of Mobile, Alabama. On paper, he was no longer a trucking man at all. He was fully and legally a shipping man, completely compliant with the exact rule built to keep operators like him boxed inside a single lane. What his old competitors didn't understand was that he hadn't abandoned his trucking instincts. He'd simply moved them across an ownership line the law couldn't touch and was about to build the most trucking-minded shipping company anyone had ever seen. Owning the ships, though, meant nothing if they couldn't do what he wanted. And that was something the shipping industry considered a solved problem that had already reached its natural limit. Cargo ships in 1955 were loaded the way cargo ships had been loaded for roughly 200 years. Crates, barrels, sacks, and bales were slung individually by crane into a ship's hold, then stacked by hand by large gangs of dock workers, item by item, sometimes 8 to 10 days on each end of a single voyage. Loading a medium-sized ship the conventional way cost around $5.86 per ton, and a meaningful share of that simply evaporated into wages, delay, breakage, and theft. Everyone in the industry accepted this as the unavoidable cost of moving cargo by sea. It had always been slow and expensive, so nobody was actively hunting for a way to make it fast and cheap. McLean looked at the shipping industry from the outside, with a trucker's eyes instead of a sailor's, and noticed something the shipping industry itself had stopped seeing because it was too familiar to register. Oil tankers routinely sailed up and down the coast with their entire top deck completely empty. Dead space, doing nothing, on hundreds of voyages a year. Nothing in any regulation said that space had to stay empty. So instead of designing and commissioning an expensive new purpose-built cargo ship from scratch, McLean bought an aging World War II tanker, the Potrero Hills, reinforced its deck with steel, and rechristened it the Ideal X. On April 26, 1956, the Ideal X left berth 26 at Port Newark, carrying 58 standardized steel containers, each 35 feet long, stacked on that once useless top deck, alongside a normal load of 15,000 tons of bulk petroleum underneath. Loading those 58 containers took less than 8 hours. 5 days later, the ship docked in Houston, where 58 trucks were already waiting to collect them and drive straight to their final destinations without a single item inside ever being touched, unpacked, or repacked along the way. Do the comparison yourself. Conventional break bulk loading ran about $5.86 a ton. McLean's container system brought that down to roughly 16 cents a ton, something like 35 times cheaper on the exact same cargo. That is not a marginal efficiency gain found by trimming costs at the edges. That is an entirely different economic category of shipping, hiding the whole time in a piece of unused deck space that thousands of tanker captains had sailed past without a second thought. The Union official who wanted to sink the ship wasn't wrong to be worried. He understood, faster than the naval architects who'd predicted it would roll over, that this wasn't a stunt. It was a working system about to make an enormous number of entrenched jobs disappear. But a single, fast, cheap ship is easy to dismiss as a one-off trick if nobody else can copy the format. And that brings us to the third move, the one that, on the surface, looks like McLean handing away the single most valuable asset he'd ever created, to make containers stackable, liftable by crane in seconds, and secure enough to survive an ocean crossing. McLean worked from 1955 onward with an engineer named Keith Tantlinger. Together, they settled on a design. Boxes 8 feet wide and 8 feet tall, built in 10-foot modular units of corrugated steel, with a mechanical corner casting and twist lock fitting at each of the 4 top corners. A crane operator could drop a spreader bar onto those corners, rotate the locks in one motion, and lift an entire loaded container in seconds. The same mechanism that let containers stack 8 units high without crushing one another. It was, by any measure, one of the most commercially valuable mechanical designs of the decade. The obvious move, the one every patent holder before and since has made with a discovery this valuable, was to lock it behind a patent and charge every shipping line on Earth a licensing fee for the next 20 years. Tantlinger talked McLean out of it. Instead of protecting the design, McLean released the patented corner casting and twist lock system to the wider industry, essentially royalty-free. So any port, shipbuilder, or competing line could build compatible equipment without paying him a cent. On its face, this looks like giving away a fortune. For close to 20 years afterward, the industry stayed a mess of incompatible formats. Matson ran 24-foot containers on the West Coast, Sealand ran 35-foot boxes on the East Coast, and other lines used their own locking hardware, none of it interchangeable. It took the International Organization for Standardization years of negotiation, using McLean and Tantlinger's freely available design as the technical foundation, before the industry finally converged on the 20 and 40-foot sizes every container ship still uses today. Here's what makes the giveaway make sense. A format that costs nothing to copy is a format everyone has a reason to adopt. Had McLean kept the twist lock behind licensing fees, competing lines would have had every incentive to build their own incompatible system, splitting the market into permanently rival formats forever. By making the core mechanism free, McLean didn't earn money on every corner, casting bolted onto every box in the world. He made sure that when the industry finally standardized, it standardized on his geometry, his logic, his system. He gave away the format and kept the advantage of having built it first. But a global standard on paper means nothing if the docks in your own country refuse to let your ships in. And the docks were about to become the most dangerous battlefield of all. Cargo handling in the mid-1950s was an entire economic and social structure built around large, tightly organized gangs of dock workers, with labor costs on some routes eating up close to half the total cost of a voyage. Work rules at old congested piers like Manhattan's had hardened into place across decades of labor disputes. Every ton McLean moved by container was, in blunt terms, a ton that no longer needed 20 men and a full day. It needed a crane operator and less than a minute. The dockworkers' unions understood exactly what was coming, faster than most of the shipping industry did. Rather than trying to force his container system into piers that had been built, staffed, and unionized around break-bulk cargo for generations, McLean made a quieter move. He built his primary operation across the river from Manhattan, at the comparatively undeveloped Port Newark Elizabeth site, where he could design the docks, the cranes, and the workflow entirely around containers from the ground up, instead of retrofitting them onto a century of existing infrastructure and existing labor agreements. By August of 1963, Sealand had opened a purpose-built, 101-acre marine terminal at Newark Elizabeth specifically engineered for container traffic, a facility that didn't need to negotiate around old habits, because it had never operated any other way. It's the equivalent of realizing you can't convince an old house's wiring to safely carry a modern electrical load, so instead of fighting that wiring for years, you simply build a new house next door with the right wiring already built in, and let the market decide which house it wants to live in. The dockworkers' unions on both coasts didn't disappear or surrender quietly. They fought this battle at the negotiating table for years, eventually securing landmark agreements that guaranteed severance pay and pension protections for workers displaced by mechanization in exchange for allowing containerization to move forward industry-wide. But by the time that organized response fully took shape, McLean already had a complete, profitable, working alternative system running in parallel to the old docks, generating its own momentum and its own economics that got harder to argue against with every voyage. The loudest opposition, though, wasn't going to come from a picket line at all. It was going to come from the exact regulatory system that had once tried to keep McLean permanently boxed inside trucking in the first place, and this time, it wasn't going to settle for simply refusing him permission. This next one, I want you to pay close attention to, not because it's the most technical move in this story, because it's the one where the trucking and rail companies McLean was quietly outcompeting stopped competing with him in the marketplace, and instead tried to use the full weight of federal law to shut his entire company down. Even though McLean had already resigned from the presidency of McLean Trucking and placed his remaining ownership in a trust specifically to satisfy the Interstate Commerce Act's rule against cross-ownership, 7 railroad companies jointly filed a formal accusation against him anyway, arguing that his effort to establish a coastwise container shipping service still violated the act. It wasn't a request for a small adjustment. It was an attempt to block him from operating the business at all. McLean, unable to secure the commission's approval for the structure he'd originally wanted, was ultimately forced to divest from trucking completely and irreversibly, betting his entire remaining fortune on an unproven shipping venture in an industry where he had zero prior experience and no safety net if it failed. And the railroads didn't stop once Sealand was up and running. As containerization proved, voyage after voyage, that it could genuinely undercut rail freight on the Atlantic and Gulf coastwise routes, competing railroads began filing steeply reduced rate proposals of their own, not rates designed to actually turn a profit, but rates specifically structured to push below the real cost of providing the service, aimed squarely at making Sea-Land's routes unprofitable until the company simply couldn't survive. This wasn't a clever regulatory reading anymore. This was open economic warfare, fought entirely inside government hearing rooms by an industry that had spent 2 decades using exactly this kind of maneuver to keep smaller competitors out. The fight escalated all the way to the United States Supreme Court in 1963. In a case that asked a question with enormous consequences: could a century-old government-protected transportation monopoly legally use predatory, below-cost pricing to force a faster, cheaper competitor out of existence, simply because the old monopoly had always been allowed to set its own rates? The court sided against the predatory pricing. Regulated rate competition, the ruling made clear, had to reflect genuine costs, not a coordinated effort by an entrenched industry to legislate a better competitor out of business. And here's the detail that separates this final move from every other trick in this story. The mystery engine got banned. The valve trick, if this were a different industry, would have gotten regulated into oblivion. But McLean's container system and the economics underneath it were never going to be regulated away, because by the early 1960s, the numbers were simply too far ahead of the alternative for any hearing room to argue them out of existence. Instead of killing containerization, the railroads and truckers who had spent years trying to strangle it in committee rooms were eventually forced to adapt around it, build their own container divisions, and compete inside a system Malcolm McLean had built entirely from the outside. Here's what I want you to sit with after this video ends. Every single move I've walked you through, selling a trucking empire to legally sidestep an ownership rule, converting a tanker's empty deck instead of building an expensive new ship, giving away a patent that could have made him rich twice over, building a new port instead of fighting an old one, and surviving a direct legal assault from 7 railroads that reached the highest court in the country. None of it required a laboratory. None of it required a fortune he didn't personally risk. None of it came from some secret piece of technology nobody else had access to. Every one of those 5 moves came from one man asking a question the entire transportation industry had quietly stopped asking. What does the rule actually say, word for word, and not what everyone has simply agreed it probably means? What is sitting completely unused in plain sight right now because everybody assumes it's worthless? What fight is everyone treating as something they have to win by force, when it could simply be built around instead? Malcolm McLean wasn't a naval engineer. He wasn't a lawyer. He had a high school education, a used truck he bought during the Depression, and a habit of reading contracts and regulations with a level of literal attention that made everyone around him deeply uncomfortable. He is reported to have said, long after the fact, that the entire idea first struck him decades earlier while he stood on a dock watching men unload his truck bale by bale, wondering why the whole trailer couldn't simply be lifted onto the ship without anyone ever touching what was inside it. Today, well over 90% of the world's manufactured goods travel at some point inside a standardized steel box that traces its geometry directly back to a corner casting. Malcolm McLean gave away for free. The trucking firms and the railroads that once used federal hearing rooms to try to keep him out of the water now run enormous container divisions of their own. The union that wanted to sink his first ship where it sat now represents workers loading and unloading containers by the millions every single year. Every cheap product you've ever bought that was made on the other side of the planet, shipped across an ocean, and still cost less than it has any right to cost, is downstream of a truck driver from Maxton, North Carolina, who refused to accept that the rule everyone else was following actually said what everyone else assumed it said.